next professional and one of the best experts in carbon credits. It's a pretty common question nowadays. What does it mean, carbon credits? Many companies, many people, individuals, they're talking about carbon credits. So Matt, let us know, what does it mean? What should we know about that?
Great. Well, thank you, Alex. I won't say all the answers because I don't know if there's anyone in the world that knows all the answers with regard to carbon credits and where forest management fits in, because things are evolving. Seems like on a daily basis with new programs and lots of new techniques related to understanding our forests and what they store for carbon and how much they sequester. So special thanks to Alex and the team for putting this great conference together, and great to hear from perspectives all around the world about where we are with wood and technology and new and emerging markets. I'm going to talk specifically about harvested wood products and how they are a part of forest carbon credit programs and what that means for people that are managing forests, for landowners that are thinking of enrolling their lands in forest carbon programs. I'll just kind of touch the surface and really focus on the harvested wood piece, because a lot of folks are interested really in how the forest gets managed and what's left in the forest, but we don't always think about the harvested wood products when it comes to carbon credit programs. So I want to spend some time talking about that and talking about some challenges and future issues related to that. So I'm Matt Russell. I'm a forest analytics consultant. I support forestry companies and organizations with their data and their analytics needs. I'm based here in the United States, in the state of Maine, and work with companies and nonprofits and other organizations for understanding how they can use their data to leverage and to make good decisions going into the future. And so there's really no doubt. I mean, harvested wood products store carbon. And so whether it be for things like paper, which obviously has a pretty short life cycle versus a home, there's a lot of carbon stored in the wood products that we use when we manage forests and when we harvest timber. And so I'll talk a lot about today what we think about as the half-life of biomass or the half-life of carbon. And that's different depending on what kind of product you're taking from the forest and turning that wood into. Obviously, like I mentioned, for paper is a pretty short life cycle, down to just as small as 6 years, versus homes where it's much longer. And so what we're trying to do a lot in the US is to think about how do we manage our forests sustainably, and then especially with the more durable, long-lived forest products, how can we basically lock up that carbon in things like mass timber buildings, big buildings, multi-story buildings built and designed with wood. And so that's really a big push that is going on now in the United States. And so certainly when it comes to understanding, how much harvested wood products are out there, we can lean on resources like from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who outline how we estimate annual harvested wood product contributions for things like national greenhouse gas inventories and estimates of emissions and removals from the forest. And so there is a lot of documentation put forth kind of at the international level that helps us to understand how much harvested wood is out there and how it changes through time, because that's a big thing, especially as you're thinking about carbon credit programs and say a 100-year time horizon where you might be under contract. Understanding that those products are going to change and decay through time is really important. And so we need to look at some of the IPCC guidelines for this. And each country and eventually each carbon credit program is going to adopt their own methodologies and be a little bit slightly different. And so just for some perspective, in the United States, the harvested wood products pool represents 2,700 million metric tons of carbon across the entire country. And so we can think of that carbon being stored both in products in use, which you see here in green, and then in landfills or in solid waste disposal sites, which you see here in orange. And the important thing to know is that this has increased, at least since the last 30 years, as we look back to really when a lot of the the Kyoto Protocol and some of the really landmark legislation and initiatives related to climate change really came up. And so it just provides an important perspective that the harvested wood products pool is big, I'm sure in your country as well. And so in the US, this is actually 5% of all the forest carbon in the entire country when we include what's in the forest, what's in the urban trees, what's stored in woodlands or kind of low density forests. And so it's an incredible amount, and we need to recognize that they play additional roles, in meeting our climate and forest management goals. I want to walk through just a case study as one example of how we might think about this. And this is an example from an oak, primarily an oak stand. This is northern red oak in the state of New York here in the United States. Um, I'm sorry, I'm in the US, so many of my measurements and my metrics are in English units. And so as an example here, 188 square feet per acre. This stand had in, say, this year. And then we're going to use a tool, a forest growth simulator, to see what this stand might look like under management into the future. And so we're going to use a shelter wood on this treatment, which is basically a two-stage shelter wood in this case. We're going to kind of do a preparatory cut where we try to get some more advanced regeneration to come up. And then we're going to do a final removal cut where we take off all of the trees after that regeneration gets established. So a pretty standard technique that's done in some of these oak systems here in the United States. And so we're going to use the forest growth model, the forest vegetation simulator. This is really it's the gold standard in the US for forest growth models to understand how carbon changes through time under different forest management scenarios. So that's a tool we'll use. And then here are the results. And so you're looking at the total stand carbon here on the y-axis, and then we're going from 2023 out 100 years, which you can see there. And you can see kind of the numbers that it's tracking over here on the left. But we're going to basically implement two harvests, like I said, the prep cut and the removal cut in 2033 and 2043. And that kind of goes through time. And so what you see in blue is the total stand carbon. So that's really just what's in the trees left in the stand. And so you can see it as the harvests occur, the amount stored in the stand goes down. But what you see in the orange is what gets added to the harvested wood products pool for those products that are either in use, they're in tables, they're in paper, whatever resulted from that harvest, or they're in landfills or solid waste disposal sites. And so you can see there basically how much is in that harvested wood products pool. And so after both of the harvests occur, we get quite a bit of carbon stored in those harvested wood products pool, but then that decays through time. Obviously the stand bounces back and continues to grow more carbon. And then if there's no more harvesting, there's no more additional carbon being added to the harvested wood products pool, and that decays through time as things like paper, which has a short life cycle, decays, and things, products in use, end their life cycle. And so it's important to think about that. A lot of people think, when they're managing for carbon, they're only looking at the blue bars, but really that carbon stored in that wood is not leaving the atmosphere. It's just being transitioned to other products. And so we really ought to be taking into account and accounting for the orange in our assessments of forest carbon as it relates to carbon credit programs. And there's a lot of literature to help support this and a lot of ways that we can quantify and understand carbon in harvested wood products. This is really the best publication here that's used in the United States and is a part of many forest growth and yield models, but it looks at longevity of harvested wood products that's dependent on the product type, the geographic region, and then the forest type where the wood was harvested. And it kind of has those transition rates, as things develop and transition from products in use to products in landfills, and then ultimately decomposing or decaying through time. So this is one example. This is an example from here in the northeastern part of the United States. Say we started with a certain amount of carbon that was, harvested here, and then we look at it, 100 years into the future. We know these different products have different decay rates, and so, not surprisingly, paper, that green line, most of it decays within the first 10 years, and so you're not left with a lot. If you're looking to store paper for 50 years. You got to be thinking about other products. Those other products, oriented strand board, softwood plywood, softwood lumber, those tend to be kind of the more durable, more long-lived products. And so obviously if you were to, harvest and put that lumber into those products, you're getting, more of that carbon stored for a longer time period compared to kind of the more traditional, the pulp and paper industries with a very short life cycle. So just some perspective about how these things change through time as we think about understanding this. Here's another representation of that. So from that same harvest, if we were to send these into these different products, you can have a look at see kind of where these things are transitioning through 100 years. And so take as an example the oriented strand board. What you see here in purple is all the products in use. As those decay, they go into the orange, that landfill category, and then eventually into basically out of use, out of the atmosphere, which you see there in green. And so obviously for OSB, we have a lot of purple hanging on for a long time. It's a very long-lived forest product compared to paper, where a lot of that is just decaying through time. You see a lot of green here instead of purple, indicating more of that emissions at a shorter or a quicker time frame compared to some of the longer-lived forest products. When it comes to the carbon markets, here in the US, we really have two types. The first is really the regulatory carbon markets. People don't really call this anymore, but some people still think of this as more the cap and trade system. Some emitter purchases some emissions or some allowance, and that we call the cap. And then folks can trade those different allowances together if they release below the cap or if they release above the cap. So it's really a market-based initiative that's really brought about by legislation. On the other hand, and this is really where all the growth has been in the last several years, is in the voluntary forest carbon markets. And it's really been private entities, nonprofits that have really brought these together. And a lot of them are really designed for smaller property sizes. So many with shorter time commitments. So many of the folks I think that Danielle works with, those smaller landowners that own maybe less than 100 acres, this is really a great opportunity for them. And there's been a lot of new companies that are really trying to reach out to this market to get a sense of enrolling these smaller properties in these carbon market programs. And so it's really a way, these voluntary carbon markets have really democratized the carbon markets in general by allowing more people to enter it. Because previously with the regulatory carbon markets, it's really been focused more on large landowners, tens of thousands of acres at a minimum as a part of that. So the one regulatory market that's really well known here in the US is operated through the California Air Resources Board. This was through legislation in the middle 2000s that really focused on California really setting the way for understanding carbon markets and really for that state to meet their emissions goals that they've set forth. And so if you look at their methodology and their forest offset protocol, you can see there's space there for carbon and wood products. It's basically calculating the average amount of carbon that's stored in wood products over that 100-year time frame. So there's a lot of methodology there, and a lot of that it depends on some of the equations that I showed previously. On the voluntary market side, this is just one example. Vera, they're a governing or a body. They outline things through the verified carbon standard. And they've really set the stage, and this is just one example, but with this dynamic baselines approach, that's kind of a part of their larger methodology. But even as a part of that one, if harvesting occurs, those harvested wood products count. And so there's some documentation there about how to do that with some of their landowners. And there is one, the Family Forest Carbon Program is using this methodology as a part of its way to enroll landowners and get them thinking about their improved forest management and how that might relate to, in our case, looking at the harvested wood products. And I'll just kind of wrap up with talking about, just focusing on certainly the harvested wood products here, but what does that mean? Kind of larger scale technology. How can advances in wood technology really help? Obviously, a lot of that is stressed on new markets. I mentioned mass timber, things like cross-laminated timber, things like biochar, wood composites. As I said, if we compare to, if we create more durable wood products that are on Earth for a longer time, that's just going to be a bigger carbon benefit than if we're to use wood products in short-lived cycles or in short-lived wood products. And so just a tremendous amount of opportunities there with new markets. Another thing is the continued utilization of wood residuals. And so, we've made a ton of progress in the last, several decades with mills being more efficient about how they use wood, but there's even more to do. And so any advances we can do there using technology can only help to better things from a carbon perspective. With environmental changes, the relationships between climate change and forest management, I think this is a big one. If you look a lot at what forest managers are doing in terms of climate change, some of it's less intensive, but more frequent harvesting. And so from a carbon perspective, we can certainly quantify that in terms of how much those harvests relate to, say, the carbon that's going to eventually grow after that harvest occurs. But I think it's also important to kind of be always comparing to how things have been done in the past, or, from a carbon perspective, what's the baseline or what's the business as usual scenario. So as our forest management changes, in response to climate change and other things, I think we need to continue to assess, how the carbon in harvested wood products and the carbon in the woods changes with that. And then I think another thing is obviously the people element of this is so important. And so things like urbanization. In the US, there are many areas, many areas have seen increases in forest land area, but a lot of them have seen decreases in forest land areas. Cities have gotten bigger, have kind of spread their reach. And so important to be thinking about that. And then obviously this is all related to income. Generally, if people earn more money, they have a higher demand for wood products. So important to kind of have that in mind and to keep in mind those socioeconomic patterns as it relates to wood technology and how we think about forest carbon. And so that's all I have. I'm happy to talk, and I think you'll have these slides available to you if you want to look further, but my email is there. My web address is there. I try to write pretty regularly. I have a email newsletter, a LinkedIn newsletter. So I write blogs pretty regularly about, how data can help forest analytics professionals to better understand what's in their woods. So thanks again, Alex and the team for everything today.
Thank you, Matt, for introductions and this grand tour to carbon credits. And I can say that you can find Matt's books on Amazon and buy them. Maybe Matt is going to issue something new. So actually, you can find a lot about Matt and his experience.